everybody, and welcome to another Top 5 board gaming video. Today I've got something that's pretty special and a little bit off the wall. Now, I've done a lot of videos that are relatively similar to this. I did videos on historical games, I've done a video on time travel games, as well as several things where I talked about games you can learn from in some way, shape, or form. In this case, I'm going to be sort of combining all of those together and talking about period games. So what do I mean by that? I mean games that take place in a specific period of history and in some way, shape, or form show us a specific or several specific aspects of what life was like in that. Now again, this is a hugely interpretable category, and you can make a lot of arguments for certain games, especially like war games and things like that. Yes, that does show a facet of what we are going through during those time periods and things of that nature. That said, I will tell you off the bat that there are a lot of periods in history that I am not going to be able to cover, because let's face it, there are hundreds and thousands of board games that in some way, shape, or form take place in some kind of a historical context. So what I did is I picked essentially some of my favorite eras of history, and I picked out the games that I feel best represent those. Now the thing is that some of them represent it very, very well. Others represent it essentially sort of tangentially or abstractly. And I numbered them accordingly, so the better it represents the era, the higher up it is on my list. That said, you guys know I love hearing about your opinions on these types of things, especially stuff like this. What do you think about the category in general? Is it something you like to look for? Do you just view it as a somewhat arbitrary theme to have a game take place in a specific era? Or is it something you actively look for? All of that kind of stuff. You guys know I love hearing from you. I love knowing all of your various thoughts and all that kind of thing. Please put anything and everything in the comments below. But that said, we are going to go right on ahead and get started with my number 5. At number 5, I've got a game about an ancient civilization. The game itself is actually more based off of the mythology and the religious practices of this particular civilization. However, it also includes aspect of like just sort of the day-to-day lives of the people and things like that, which is why I really appreciate it. The game itself is Kemet. Now, in this game, everybody is playing as a group of Egyptians, essentially, and you are trying to build up your militaries, you are trying to appease the gods in order to summon divine creatures to assist you, you're trying to take over temples so that you can better appease said gods, all this kind of stuff. So it's a very diverse strategic game. There's a lot going on with it. It does have skirmish combat in it, although the combat does take a back seat to it. Now, like I mentioned, this game does focus more on the mythological and the religious aspects of the Egyptian people, the ancient Egyptians, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. It's actually very, very interesting, because the fact is that Egyptian mythology is one of my favorite sort of groups or categories of mythology. It's an absolutely amazingly rich tapestry of stories and all sorts of fantastical journeys and all this kind of stuff, which you tend to see in a lot of mythologies. But that said, within the game itself, we do see a lot of that aspect, and again, it's mostly in that religious context, but at the same time, you can sort of at least get a feel for what it might be like for a sort of small fry type person in the middle of ancient Egypt, dealing with the pharaohs and all this kind of thing, and what it could have been like. Because again, the religious aspect of the ancient Egyptian culture was enormously important to them. That said, the reason that this is lower on my list is simply because we don't know a great deal about it. We know the stories, we know the lore, we know all that kind of stuff, and to a great extent we do know about how the people lived. But the fact is, it happened so long ago. We're talking, what, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. It's very, very difficult to really distinctly and decidedly discern what it is that we can put into a game to really show what it's like to be in that period. That said, this isn't a very important aspect to the ancient Egyptians. It's a really fun game, and Kemet is my number 5. At number 4, I've got a game that is actually relatively similar to Kemet in terms of how it works and the mythological aspects of it, but effectively we got to go across the Mediterranean Sea in order to get there. The game itself is Cyclades, or Cyclades, whatever you want to call it. Now, the reason that this is higher up on the list, bottom line, is the fact that I personally enjoy Greek mythology more. And for those of you who haven't played this game, again, it is extremely similar to Kemet, where we are talking about appeasing the gods. We are talking about summoning these great creatures like the Kraken and Cyclopes and all of these kinds of things. And the fact is, this game does it really well. It has a lot of the lore, it has a ton of the stories in there, and the thing is, you can't sit here and just like read through the stories or whatever. It's more used as a framing device. That said, it is tremendously fun, and again, I love Greek mythology. By far, it's my favorite type of mythology, and we are talking about going and driving or riding boats around ancient Greece in the Greek Isles. So it's really interesting in that sense, but again, lower on the list simply because as far as a period game, it's a loose interpretation at best, essentially. That said, the ancient Greeks, just like the ancient Egyptians, were extremely important not only to all other societies during the time and thereafter, but that includes our modern societies as well. We have a ridiculous amount of influence that we have garnered from these civilizations, and I think it's really interesting just to see a little speck, just a tiny little speck of what even part of it was like. That said, one of the fun facts is that Cyclades as well as Kemet are actually from the same manufacturer, so you can see they are kind of on a mythological binge here with these two games. And again, they are great games, but as far as period pieces, it is a little bit of a loose interpretation, but again, that's how we roll. That's what we do. The fact is, they were important periods of time, and overall, Cyclades is my number 4. At number 3, I've got a game that takes us all the way into Victorian London. We are going to be doing some investigating with our good friend Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective. Now, in this game, this pits you against a lot of Sherlock Holmes's famous cases. Now, again, as far as a period piece is concerned, the idea is that we are in Victorian London. And this game is actually really interesting because it has like the old school style newspapers and things like that. And the idea is that you're trying to collect clues, gather information about, in this case, 10 individual cases is what the game comes with. Now, this is what I referred to at least as a play and burn game, where you've got 10 scenarios, and after you've completed them, then effectively you know what's going to happen, so there's not much of a point of playing it again. However, that said, when you're talking about this as a period piece, I mean, Sherlock Holmes is sort of a bastion of the Victorian era. Now, granted, the reason that this is number 3 and not higher on the list is because Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, but we do have a lot of interesting aspects of not only Victorian England, but the Victorian era as a whole. And that's really why I wanted to put it on this list, is because it is such a unique period of time, and we had so many new developments in science and technology and literature and art and all sorts of different aspects of humanity in general. And again, really, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, just like with Cyclades and Kemet, is just a little tiny aspect of what was going on. And again, a fictional aspect at that. However, there were a lot of very good and well-documented aspects of the Victorian era. It just happens that for that particular era, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is my personal favorite game, and thus my number 3. At number 2, 2, I've got a game that I have talked about in numerous different videos, pretty much in this exact context, as a historical marker, as historical information, a place where you can learn about certain events, all that kind of stuff. The game itself is Twilight Struggle. Now, for those of you who haven't seen my videos before, you may be unfamiliar with it. This is a game that is all about the Cold War. One side is playing as the US, and the other side is playing as Russia, or the USSR in this case. And the thing is that we are still in an era where many people who are alive today lived through the Cold War, and they had to deal with seeing all that. I mean, for crying out loud, Fidel Castro only just very recently passed away, and he wasn't part of the Cold War per se, but for crying out loud, there are cards in this game that are based on him, and he only just recently passed away. Like, it's an incredibly recent thing, and on top of that, it's also probably the largest case of nuclear fear that we ever had as a human society, because that's really what it was all about. It was about, we've got nukes, well, we do too, and who's going to launch them first was essentially what it boiled down to. And that's why, for those of you who don't know, it was called the Cold War, because nothing ever actually happened, thankfully. Because if it had, we all would have essentially been annihilated. But the fact is, the Cold War itself, it lasted from, what, like the 50s or so? Like the late 40s, early mid 50s, all the way up to the late 80s. It lasted an extremely long time. Actually, I think the dates are even on here. Yeah, see, 1945 to 1989. There you go. So essentially, the end of World War II until the Berlin Wall came down is when it officially went. Now, the reason that I love this game as a historical and period game type of thing is because of the cards. Now, for those of you who haven't played, the cards in this game represent specific people and events and aspects to the wars and all of this kind of stuff that was going on during the course of the years that this game spans. So what do we have? We've got the end of World War II, so we've got German Reconstruction, we've got the Marshall Plan, we've got the beginnings of the Cold War, when the USSR started going into South America and subsequently Cuba. We've got the issue with China and the way that the game abstractly represents Chinese power going back and forth type of thing. We also have the Vietnam War, which created a huge amount of not only controversy, but a lot of shuffling of political power and all that kind of thing. So it's an incredibly good, or a surprisingly good, I should say, historical account of what actually occurred. And the thing is, I mean, I didn't really live through it, so I can't really say for certain, but it's what I imagine living through that era might have been like, where you're constantly fearing for what's going to happen around the corner. Now, obviously, I am not naive enough to think that, should I play this card? Oh no, it's going to hurt me. I don't think that having that mentality is nearly at all the same as having the mentality of, holy crap, we might get a nuclear bomb dropped on us at any time. I am not that stupid, don't worry. But that said, as far as capturing what the time period was about, Twilight Struggle really does a great job of that. And that's why it's all the way up on number 2, because frankly, this is a very well-researched, well-done game about some real historical and very scary events that occurred in our very recent history. So it is my number 2. And number 1, I've got a game that is going to take us back in time. Not quite as far as the mythological ones that I was talking about before, but we are going farther back than the Victorian era. Specifically, we are going to be heading to feudal Japan with Shogun. Now, in this case, I've got the Shogun Big Box that I got off of Kickstarter a couple of months ago, so this includes a bunch of expansions. But that said, this game is incredible as a period piece. The thing is that we have actual people who are living, we have actual samurai that we can read and learn about. We've got their approximate birth and death dates. We've got information about what they did, where they lived, who they fought, all that kind of stuff. And so you're playing as these characters We also have information about the economy though, and that's really what pushed this particular game over the edge for me above like Twilight Struggle, because Twilight Struggle does a great job of showing us the events and sort of the mentality of the people during that time. But with Shogun Big Box, not even just the Big Box, but just in general Shogun, we get not only those aspects where we learn about the militaristic aspects and we learn about the personal aspects of the people, but we also see a larger economic picture as well of feudal Japan. We see the hierarchy of the actual feudal ranks. We see the economy in terms of how the island of Japan was divided. We have like the territorial control. You also have to make certain that you're getting enough food to all of your soldiers and all this kind of stuff. So it's a great combination of a lot of different mechanics. And again, I am no historian. I am not going to sit here and tell you that this is equivalent to like studying feudal Japan, because by no means is it. However, as far as period games go, this does a lot to show us a great deal about that time period. And that's why I really love it, and that is also why it is my number one. Well everybody, that's it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this video on my top 5 favorite period board games. Now you may have noticed that I skipped a lot of really major ones. Probably the biggest major one that I skipped was World War II. Now you guys know I am a fan of World War II games. I have a decent number of them. I mean, you can even see right there I've got Axis and Allies, and I do have several others, and obviously there are literally hundreds of games solely dedicated to World War II. But what I wanted to do, I wanted to go a little bit farther out, a little bit of expansion beyond that, all that kind of stuff. That said, again, I can't possibly cover all eras of history in a single video like this, and so that, in part at least, is why I love hearing from you guys. Once again, please let me know your thoughts on this topic. What are your favorite games that fit into this category? Do you like games that fit better, that give a more complete picture of what it was like living in those times? Or do you prefer games that do it a little bit more abstractly and simply use that time period as sort of a framing device and things of that nature? Because again, there are a lot of games that do that as well. I am always very, very curious to hear what you guys have to say. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.